If you've been following this channel for any period of time, then you know that I love Devil May Cry. And Devil May Cry 5 wasn't just a good DMC game, it's probably one of the best action games ever created. And one of the things I love so much about DMC is the boss fights. You know, I've played a lot of action games out there that completely drop the ball in the boss fight department, where the boss fight will just be a giant monster with a series of glowing red weak points that the player will have to attack, and usually they have an overly inflated health pool. Now, generally speaking, that isn't the case for DMC, and there are a few exceptions to the rule, and believe me, I will talk about them and rip into them, but for the most part, bosses in Devil May Cry actually test the player's skills and abilities. They aren't usually giant. A lot of the times they're around the player's size or manageable to that degree. And for the most part, a lot of these bosses in the game actually fight the player on their terms. Like, they don't just have an overly inflated health pool, they actually have good mobility options. They can keep up with your speed and your pace. They have good attacks and combos, and they'll test your skills up until that point in the game. They'll test you if you know how to dodge properly, if you know how to use your mobility options, if you know how to attack in the air, and if you know how to use the style system effectively. That's one of the reasons why I love Devil May Cry so much. There are some boss fights in this game where you don't feel like you're fighting another monster, but another player. But before I really analyze every single boss fight in Devil May Cry 5, I gotta get the shameless self-promotion out of the way. Please like, comment, and subscribe to the Gaming Grappler. I can't stress this enough, but the more you interact with this content, the more I'll be able to deliver to you guys on a more frequent and regular basis. And with that being said, let's get on with the show. The very first boss fight in this game is less of a fight and more of a set piece, although you do have another chance to fight him later on, and that's Urizen on the throne. And what makes this fight so unique is that while it is possible for the player to defeat Urizen at this point and get an alternate ending, it's highly unlikely because it's actually pretty complicated. In my opinion, I find that for whatever reason, Urizen on the throne is a lot more difficult than his follow-up forms that are supposed to be, in theory, more challenging. And I don't know why that is. I think maybe it's because you can only fight him on one angle. But what makes this boss fight so interesting is that you can't attack Urizen without first damaging this glowing gem that blocks all the damage. And Urizen also has plenty of ranged attacks to keep the player at bay. He has giant lasers. He could rain death from above with swarm missiles. And he can also briefly freeze time. He basically will shoot out these glowing orbs that create an area of effect that slows down time. It's kind of similar to the Greyon attacks that you'll also fight later on in the game. And overall, it's a pretty interesting boss fight. I think the player will have more of an advantage on a second playthrough when they know how to fight better in the air and jump cancel and stay more airborne so they could avoid more of those ground laser attacks. And overall, yeah, this is a pretty good boss fight to start the game. So I'm just going to make a quick little edit from post here because while I was getting footage, I found out what my main issue with Urizen was and why I had such a hard problem with him while he was on the chair. It's a bit of a visual mess. Now, I'm not going to say this is an objective criticism because for all I know, this could just be a me problem, but there's a lot of purples and reds and everything kind of blends together, especially when he's launching so many projectiles at you at once. Kind of looks like there's fireworks blowing up in your face the entire time, and you could get lost in the malaise of the action and whatever's going on there. Again, I won't say this is an objective criticism, but it is a problem I personally had when I was fighting Urizen in this arena. All right, let's get back to the show. And up next is the Qyphon roots, and I honestly don't have much to say here because this barely even qualifies as a boss fight, and I think Capcom agrees with me because you don't even fight the Qyphon roots in the Bloody Palace. And I think a reason why is that this is more of an obstacle course for the player that's been given a health bar. And the Qyphon roots is basically a really dumbed down and simple version of Urizen. It's the same sort of idea where you can only fight the boss on one angle where it's pinned against the wall. Its attacks are easily telegraphed. They will shine in advanced. And on higher difficulty settings, the game will scale the difficulty not by making the boss fight more challenging, but by spawning enemies in the room. And generally speaking, whenever a boss fight has to rely on outside help by making the player fight other enemies, it generally goes to show that it's not a good fight. the boss fight can't even rely on its own moveset and abilities. Enough said. And up next is one of my favorite boss fights in the game, and that's Goliath. And on a side note, it seems pretty obvious to me that Goliath's character design was directly inspired off of Elvis's demon form from Godhand. And Godhand is a criminally underrated character action game. I find that a lot of fans of the genre have given it due, but if you're new, definitely check out Godhand. Very difficult game, but aside from that, Goliath is a fantastic introductory boss fight. It's also the first boss fight where Nero will talk trash to a giant demon, and that's one of the core power fantasies and appeal of Devil May Cry, where your protagonist is so cocky and overpowered that they will talk trash to a giant demon from hell itself, and they can completely back it up. And what makes Goliath so interesting is that he's the first legitimate challenge that the player is expected to overcome. He's highly aggressive, and the only time he'll really slow down is when he's trying to charge up a giant area of effect attack. And while he is highly aggressive and he'll attack the player with various combos, his strikes are slow and telegraphed enough that the player will be able to react accordingly. It's a good opportunity for you to experiment with more complicated techniques like mastering the timing to your dodging, trying to work on a table hopper. And what's also unique about Goliath is that he seems to be perfectly balanced around no matter what character you're using in the game, and that's pretty unique because a lot of bosses are a lot easier depending on what character you're using, except for Goliath. Goliath seems to be pretty well balanced across the board. Let me explain. Nero, he's pretty well balanced in that there are various modes where he'll be stunned and Nero can throw him. And again, it's a good opportunity to work on table hopper. But if you're Dante, Goliath's attacks are slow enough that you'll be tempted to use your Royal Guard on him. And what's unique about Goliath is that if you don't time your Royal Guard properly, if you don't time it absolutely perfectly, Goliath can actually stagger Dante in his stance, and he's one of the few bosses in the game that can do that. Goliath also has a secondary form where he will try to suck the player up like he's Kirby from Super Smash Bros. And in this mode, he'll be powered up, he'll be highly aggressive, and he'll start bull rushing the player. And the player will also have the opportunity to counter that with either Devil Breakers or a Royal Guard or various attacks in your arsenal. He also has meteors he will shoot at you, and it's a very unique part in the game. And overall, I'd say that Goliath is the first legitimate challenge and one of my favorite boss fights in the game. And up next is Artemis. And Artemis is the first fan service boss in the game. If you played Devil May Cry 3 before, you may have come across a hidden weapon that goes by the same name. And it was always a bit of a letdown, because in the lore of Devil May Cry, every devil arm you come across at one point or another used to be an actual demon. And I don't want to get lost in the woods here, but basically it's a form of submission and survival that the demon turns itself into a weapon. But it was always a huge disappointment coming across Artemis without fighting a boss fight. It was like getting a robot master power up in Mega Man without fighting a robot master. That is, until we play Devil May Cry 5 and we get to actually fight Artemis in its demon form, and it lives up to the hype. Now, in my opinion, Artemis wasn't as fun to fight as Goliath, but I also believe that Artemis serves an important purpose in this game. The point of Artemis is to teach new players how to fight in the air, and it perfectly delivers on that premise. Now, the fight is more balanced around fighting Nero. Nero is the only character that gets a cutscene for fighting Artemis. V only fights are in a boss rush mode, and Dante only fights Artemis in the Bloody Palace. And both V and Dante have options that just trivialize the entire point of this boss fight. So I'm kind of just gonna ignore them till the end of this segment. For Nero, it's a bit of a challenge for new players. You fight Artemis in a giant arena. Artemis is also one of the few boss fights in this game that spends most of the time floating in the air. Those wings are not just for show. She also doesn't have any melee attacks whatsoever, with the exception of this one technique where she does this kamikaze move where she barrels herself towards the player, but at that point, Artemis is just becoming the projectile. The main strategy that the AI uses against the player is keep away tactics. Artemis's main job is to take advantage of the huge size of the arena so she can pelt the player with projectile attacks. Some of those projectiles are these drones that fire autonomously. Now, the good thing is that if Nero destroys these drones, he can grapple off them and close the distance in seconds. Now, what's neat about this setup is that since Artemis is consistently floating in the air, the player is going to be incentivized to stay airborne as much as humanly possible. And with that incentivization, you're going to experiment. You're going to try new ways of staying in the air to deal damage. You're going to stumble into jump canceling and the enemy step just as a matter of fact. Artemis also has one move to knock the player off them when they get into close range, and it's this short range area of effect scream that has a huge windup that is going to give player time to dodge and also further experiment. They'll use devil breakers like Gerbera that can give them some distance and dodge right at the last second, and they can once again get close to the boss by using input commands like streak, or they could just use wire snatch. Either way, it's a good boss fight for teaching the player mechanics in the air. Now, what I find really fun about fighting this boss is using Dante. Dante just completely makes a mockery of Artemis. Since he has so many guns and projectile weapons at his disposal, you can just instantly destroy her drones in half of her attacks by using the gunslinger style. Also, keeping up with Artemis is no problem. Dante moves like an anime character. By using ground trick and air trick, you can keep up with Artemis. No, you are faster than her and you'd be up in her face in seconds. And Dante is the Sky King in this game. Staying airborne with Dante is trivial. It just makes short work of Artemis. Again, you can jump in the air, use Trickster to dash out of the way, and then teleport back in her face. Like, it's just awesome. And when she does her kamikaze barrel attack, that's the perfect opportunity to launch a Royal Guard. And man, does it feel satisfying. And up next, we have two V exclusive boss fights that I'm just going to speedrun because I got to give you guys a little disclaimer here, but I don't like V's gameplay. Now, there's nothing mechanically wrong with the V. He functions just fine, and I'll give Itsuno credit for creating a character that plays nothing like any character action protagonist out there. But if I'm going to be honest to give you guys my true opinion, I just conceptually don't like V. I'm not a big fan of sitting in the corner while I watch all my Pokemon do all the fighting on my behalf. I like to be more personally involved in the combat. If V played something more like Dio from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and that he fought side by side with his standard familiars, I probably would have liked the character more. But with that being said, I'm going to give you guys my best crack at an analysis for this character's boss fights. And up first is the Nidhogg Parasite. The Nidhogg Parasite feels like an answer to V's gameplay in that he doesn't fight you on his own, he fights you with a swarm of demon tendrils. So it's basically a team deathmatch. And what the player's going to have to be careful and mindful in this fight is when to use Nightmare and when not to use him. Believe it or not, when the Nidhogg is isolated on his own, that's actually not a good time to call out Nightmare because that's a waste of Devil Trigger. You actually want to use this opportunity to pull out the book and use Shadow and Griffon to deal damage, so you can build Devil Trigger so that when he calls out his swarm of tentacles, you can easily annihilate them with Nightmare. That's the core strategy to this boss fight. You need to do as much damage as humanly possible quickly. It's a DPS race. And that's all I got. Sorry, again, I'm not a master of V's gameplay. And up next, we have the Elder Greyon Knight. And the Greyon was one of the coolest bosses from Devil May Cry 3. How could it not be? It is a giant blue flaming horse that can freeze time. You're fighting that exact same boss fight, but now in HD with photorealistic graphics with a badass heavy metal knight riding on top of it. From a storytelling perspective, I have no idea why V thought he could take this guy on who could freeze time, but he couldn't take Gilgamesh. It seems to me like this guy just didn't have his power scaling working internally, but yeah, you could actually win this boss fight. The Elder Greyon Knight is pretty cool. The time freezing mechanic actually forces V to be more strategic when he calls out his demons. If you call them out while he's slowing down time, you could lose all three of your demons in a single burst. Whenever he freezes time, you need to focus on evasion and long distance attack. Whenever you're free, that's when you're going to want to call out all your demons to do as much damage as humanly possible. I also found that breaking lock on and running away made this boss go a lot more smoothly, and focusing on dodging his lightning bolts at the last second was a good opportunity to build up Devil Trigger. And overall, it's a pretty cool boss fight, but only for V. And like I said, that's all I got because I'm not a master of V's gameplay, but luckily I only had to cover 2 bosses for him. And now we have the biggest pile of trash in this game, and that's Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is based off of the hand-to-hand combat weapon that Dante gets in Devil May Cry 4, so it's kind of a fan service boss. But it kind of fails because unlike most boss fights, Gilgamesh follows a lackluster design that I complained about in the start of this video. You have to attack his weak points for massive damage. And what makes bosses from Devil May Cry so good is that they don't rely off of having giant glowing weak points. What makes them a challenge isn't their size, but the fact they have movesets more advanced than the typical enemy that you come across. They're mobile and aggressive, but Gilgamesh feels like a boss fight that you would see in a bargain bin Resident Evil 4 knockoff. It's no surprise we'd never see this guy in Bloody Palace. He is a complete chore to fight. He just wastes your time. God forbid you forget to grapple off him and you have to wait till he finishes climbing a building to go fight him. On Dante Must Die mode, he's just a giant damage sponge that wastes your time. So yeah, again, Gilgamesh is complete garbage. I mean, at most, I guess the boss tests your ability to fight in the air, and it's a nice change of pace. But again, on higher difficulty settings, he just is a time vampire. Gilgamesh is complete garbage. And up next, we have my number 2 favorite boss fight in the game, because let's be honest here, we all know who's number 1. Anyway, it turns out that the badass heavy metal knight riding a Greyon was a lot stronger once he got off of his mount. And Cavaliere Angelo's moveset is so cool. He would be the final boss fight in a lesser game, but this is Devil May Cry, baby. And at first glance, he might look like a bit of a Dark Souls boss knockoff, but you would be wrong. The main point of Cavaliere Angelo is to teach the player the importance of counter mechanics. It's important to note that the first character you fight Cavaliere Angelo with is Dante, who has many counter mechanics, including the Royal Guard, a technique in which the player can put themselves vulnerable for a second to reflect an enemy's attack right back at them. And Cavaliere Angelo's main weaknesses is parries. At the start of the fight, he will fire lightning orbs at you that are perfect for the player to charge up their Royal Guard meter. When he gets up close and personal, he'll attack you with a series of combos that are weak to being parried or using the Royal Guard technique. Knock the sword out of his hand, and you'll be staggered for a few seconds. It's also important to note that the boss has a few tricks up of his sleeve. He disrupts the rhythm of his attacks. Players will notice that his fast strikes are actually easy to parry and land a Royal Guard off of reflex, but his slow strikes actually disrupt the player's rhythm and timing. He can also summon lightning strikes from above to layer on top of his physical combos, which will also disrupt the player's timing. He has an area of effect explosion and a powerful teleport combo as well that deals plenty of damage. Whenever Cavaliere Angelo loses the charge from his sword, he'll be in a weakened state, and this is perfect opportunity for the player to land their most damaging combos. Overall, I say that this is one of my favorite bosses to fight in the game. He's fun to even fight with Nero and V, and I'd say that he's been perfectly executed. Overall, a really good boss fight. And now we have Proto Angelo and his gang squad. I was debating if this was even proper to be on the list. This is less of a boss fight and more of an elaborate set piece. Both Proto Angelo and Pseudo Angelo, I don't know how to pronounce that properly, are lesser demons that you fight normally in the game. But again, this was presented as a boss fight. It is a cool set piece, so I'll treat it like that. And I kind of feel like Proto Angelo and Pseudo Angelo are not as cool as their Devil May Cry 4 counterparts. Again, Proto Angelo and his buddies there actually mix in pretty well with the Devil May Cry 5 roster. They're pretty balanced for that. But the Bianco Angelos from Devil May Cry 4 had a larger moveset and would even fight the player in the sky, something that Proto Angelo can't even do. They also had cool attack formations. When they get into groups of 3 or more, they would get even more powerful techniques and they would launch giant orbs at the player, and it was pretty cool. But again, while the set piece where you fight Proto Angelo is cool, it's basically a 5-on-5 team deathmatch with Nero, V, and his familiars versus the squad on a falling building. Again, I'm gonna have to rate this one pretty low because it barely even qualifies as a boss fight, but it was a cool set piece. And now we have Urizen, but this time he got his ass off the couch. He retains the same gimmick he had when he was sitting down, in that if you want to deal actual damage to Urizen, then you're going to need to take out the crystal barrier that's absorbing all the damage. He has the same projectile moves he had when he was sitting down, except this time, Urizen has some pretty cool melee attacks thrown in for good measure. He has an area of effect explosion, a few combos, but one of his cool new abilities is he'll actually attack you with the Quaifod roots that are hanging off his back, And the tracking on these things is cinematic and really good. Like, the player will dodge one route, only for that exact same route to wrap around and then hit the player from a different angle. It's really cool, and it must have been a complete nightmare for the developers to program. It's caught me off guard a bunch of times while I was playing the game. The first time you fight Urizen for real in this form is with Dante. And this is when the game gives you Sin Devil Trigger and a free pop to use for free on your first playthrough. And using Sin Devil Trigger is the fastest way to destroy this gem, but if you're playing on an alternate playthrough or in the Bloody Palace, then that might not necessarily be available. What's so difficult about Urizen in this form is that he will spam projectiles nonstop, and it's kind of hard to find an opportunity to get some hits in the gem. I found what worked for me was to not stay airborne, because staying airborne I found was a lot more difficult in this form, but to stay on the ground and wait for Urizen to wind up one of his melee attacks. After that, you can use Balrog to get in a bunch of hits and use one of his flaming dragon punches. I find that the more damage the crystal takes, the less projectile attacks Urizen will actually throw at you, which gives you more opportunity to get some good damage in and then open them up. I don't know if that's intentional or if that's a flaw in the AI or if that's how the boss fight is supposed to go, but I found that that worked for me. Once the gem is destroyed, Urizen is a bit of a cakewalk. You could just style on him. He no longer has any projectile attacks, and his melee moves are not sufficient enough to deal damage. He might spawn in some Quaifod roots, but sometimes those even have health. Now, one of my big problems with this boss fight is that it has a lot of the same problems he had when he was sitting down, and that it can be a visual mess at times. Now, I got to give you guys a little disclaimer here. That could just be a me problem, so I'm not going to take away any points from the fight, but I found it was a bit messy. Urizen in the background are all kind of purple and red, and when he's firing projectiles at you, it's like fireworks going off in your face from every angle, and you could definitely get lost in the action. So it did make my eyes water a bunch. This wasn't an issue once he got into his melee form and after he destroyed the crystal, but again, I thought I'd say it and I'd be honest. But again, this was a really cool boss fight and a really good showcase of Dante's strengths and abilities. Again, really fun. And up next is Malphas. And Malphas has one of the most unique designs in the game, and you could definitely tell that she was based off of Echidna from Devil May Cry 4. Malphas is a three-headed witch on top of a giant featherless chicken. That is just pure video games, and it looks like something out of a horror movie. Just A+ on the design team. And Malphas's main mode of attack is to teleport. And you wouldn't have expect that based on the boss design. Like, you wouldn't expect this boss to be as mobile as it is. And she doesn't just teleport her whole body, but melee attacks as well. You'll be eating interdimensional hands from all angles in this boss fight. The weak point for Malphas is pretty obvious. It's the woman on top. But luckily, she also has a good defense to compensate for this. Malphas can easily knock Nero out of the air by jumping. To avoid this, the player will have to master air-based combat. V will also drop Gerbera Devil Breakers during this fight, so you can always just peace out with an air dash when you need to. But if the player is more skilled, if you time an enemy step right as Malphas is jumping in the air, you'll avoid all her big damage. And once again, Dante just absolutely cheeses this boss fight. With air trick and ground trick, Dante can keep up with Malphas's teleports and easily avoid most of her attacks and stay airborne indefinitely, and he could just absolutely cheese her. Again, this is a really awesome boss fight. The king is back in town. You know what? Screw it. I changed my mind. My new second favorite boss fight in this game is King Cerberus. Sorry, Cavaliere Angelo, but I'm gonna have to knock you down a peg on the podium. And it's kind of ironic that the very first non-lesser demon that Dante has technically fought in this series was Cerberus from Devil May Cry 3. How fitting is it that the very last demon that Dante ends up fighting is the king of the Cerberus tribe? Except unlike his Devil May Cry 3 counterpart, King Cerberus isn't screwing around here. He isn't chained to the wall, and he's in your face about it. The main gimmick behind King Cerberus is that, like the player who switches between different weapons and styles, King Cerberus will switch between 3 different elemental forms. I see what you did there, Itsuno. His first form is his fire mode, and in my opinion, this is King Cerberus at his most dangerous. While he doesn't have any projectile attacks, he is relentless when he attacks the player, and he focuses primarily on melee damage, and it's very risky to Royal Guard because of how much damage he does. His next form, his electric mode, is his easiest to go up against. This is when the player will get most of their damage in. King Cerberus in electric mode focuses on ranged attacks. He has one move where he electrifies the entire ground, but again, this is trivial to avoid. Just jump in the air and spam Ebony and Ivory. His electric orbs are also easy to counter. You could use Swordmaster and send out your summoned swords, or just use Gunslinger and get rid of them instantaneously. And again, this is just free damage. This is just a freebie by the developers. And then there's his ice form. He will spam icicles from the ceiling. He does have some melee attacks in this form, so you got to look out for those too. And he also has one final F-off move where he turns the entire arena into an area of effect blast where he'll rain icicles down from the ceiling. But if you're talented enough with Royal Guard, you could actually instantly block these and fill up your Devil Trigger meter in seconds. All in all, this is one of my favorite boss fights in the game. It's pretty fair, and it tests all the player's skills and abilities. So hats off to you, Itsuno. And now we have Urizen in his final form. After eating the Quaifod fruit, he has reached his full power, and he's cast off his armor as it was just slowing him down. There's a lot of fan service in this fight. A lot of the melee attacks that Urizen throws at you are throwbacks to Beowulf. He also attacks the player with summoned swords, which is also a throwback to Vergil's time as Proto Angelo. As for the fight itself, for whatever reason, it's significantly easier than his previous forms, and I think the main reason is that he no longer has that annoying crystal gem blocking all the attacks on his behalf. But with that being said, Urizen's moveset has also been widely expanded upon. He has all of the same projectile attacks he had in his previous forms, and then some when you include summoned swords and his area of effect spikes that he will summon towards the end of the fight. His melee combos are pretty easy to avoid. As a matter of fact, one of the easy ways to defeat Urizen is to just teleport and stay in the air. Jump canceling is pretty trivial when you use Devil Sword Dante. It's just really easy to stay in the air. Urizen's also a lot different in this form in that he's very mobile. He will teleport frequently. I think at the start of the fight, I had an easy time switching between different weapons, like using Cavaliere and even the nunchucks. But as the fight progressed and he would teleport more, I found I was relying off of Devil Sword Dante because it's just such a fast weapon and you're just guaranteed to get some hits in. I think the only real counter that Urizen has to Dante when he's in the air is to call out summoned swords. If you're caught in the air, you might not have enough time to block all the summoned swords or just whip out a gunslinger combo or just take them out when they're attacking you. But otherwise, you can avoid pretty much all of his melee attacks and all of his combos just by staying airborne. And I think the game wants you to do this because the lock-on target for Urizen is borderline near the top of his head. So every time you hit teleport, if you use ground trick or air trick, you're going to be right up in his face. And I think that this is just supposed to be a set piece where the player is supposed to be powerful. Dante has Sin Devil Trigger now, so you can deal a lot of damage and defeat Urizen with that. I think the reason why this boss fight is so easy is just from a storytelling perspective, is to showcase that Dante has become more powerful than Urizen by being a good person and earning his power legitimately by fully understanding his heritage and absorbing the Devil Sword Sparta. So again, while this fight is a lot easier than his previous forms, he's also a lot more fun to fight than his previous forms, and I had a lot of fun getting footage for this part of the video in particular. So again, good fight. Mission 18 is just pure fan service. The main point of this mission is to fight off all of V's familiars, Shadow, Griffon, and Nightmare. And the final fight has you facing all three at once. It is just pure fan service. Like, each individual demon has their own remixed theme from Devil May Cry 1, and it was pretty cool. It's just a bit of a bummer that you never get to fight the three amigos in the Bloody Palace. I'm guessing it would be a complete mess once you got to them with V. Like, just imagine having 6 demons on the screen at once. It would be a complete trash fire, and I bet you it would break the game. But otherwise, this is a pretty awesome boss fight. Shadow, Griffon, and Nightmare retain all the moves they had when you played as them with V. And I find that the best strategy to beat the three amigos is to first take out Griffon. He can harass you with his projectile attacks, and to focus on Nightmare. Nightmare deals a lot of damage, but he's very slow and easy to manage, provided you've taken out either Shadow or Griffon. He also has an ability to revive the other two familiars and to gain health throughout the fight. It's a pretty cool boss fight. My only real problems with it was that all three of these demons teleport all over the place, and your lock-on can get a little finicky, so I had a few problems with that. But Otherwise, I found that a good strategy was to take out summon swords and just send them at them. It kind of just goes on autopilot. And again, Shadow and Griffon don't have a lot of health. While they do have interesting movesets, I find that Shadow is the more difficult one out of the three to fight. While Nightmare does do more damage, Shadow has a kind of confusing moveset to look at. He can kind of hit you at multiple different ranges. But again, the main strategy, take out Griffon and go for Nightmare. And otherwise, a pretty fun and interesting boss fight. Of course, Vergil is number one. Is that even a question? I'm just going to gush here for a second, but I love this boss fight. Vergil isn't just the best final boss for Devil May Cry standards. He is the best final boss in video game history, period. No ifs, ands, or buts. Engrave it on my tombstone. There's not an ounce of hyperbole behind what I'm saying. He's just that good. You know, a lot of video games out there, when they make a difficult boss fight, it's for artificial reasons. They'll just make a giant monster who has one glowing weak point and deals a lot of damage and has an inflated health pool, but not Vergil. When you get defeated by Vergil, you get beaten because he's better than you. Unlike most other boss fights out there, Vergil has just as much as an advanced moveset as the player does. He can teleport all over the place. He has ranged attacks. He has good combos. He has 2 different devil triggers like the player, and it's just fantastic every time you fight him. When you think about it, both Dante and Vergil are 2 overpowered anime protagonists going at it. And when you finally defeat Vergil, you, the player, also feel like that overpowered protagonist because your skills are what made you overcome that obstacle. You earned it. And one of the reasons why Vergil has always been in iconic boss fights since Devil May Cry 3 is because both Dante and Vergil are similar but different. They have similar movesets, so it always feels fair. Like you're fighting a player 2 who is holding a controller in their hand. And both of these characters have unique spins on the same moves. Like both Dante and Vergil in this game have summoned swords, but they have different spins on how they use them. Dante will use his summoned swords to fight autonomously in front of them, almost like a ghost is wielding them in the air. And Vergil is a lot more conservative with the way he uses them. He uses them as augmented projectile attacks to cover and protect him and to pin enemies and demons from a distance. And both of these styles clashing are so unique. Their personalities are polar opposite. Dante is all about style. He wants to look cool in everything he does. While Vergil likes to look precise and professional. Now, to defeat Vergil, you're going to have to take advantage of the game's counter mechanics, no matter what character you're using. For Nero, use your table hopper to build up Devil Trigger and get your hits in when you can, whenever Vergil is stunned. For Dante, Royal Guard is your friend. Royal Guard is the one thing Vergil can't do, and he doesn't really have an answer for it in this game. A good opportunity to build your Royal Guard and Devil Trigger meter is whenever he fires his summoned swords individually. It's basically perfect Royal Guard bait, and Vergil has a lot of attacks that you can bounce Royal Guard off of. And otherwise, again, counter mechanics are your friend when fighting Vergil. All right, so that pretty much covers everything I wanted to say about the boss fights in Devil May Cry 5. And I could hear you already, what about the Dante fight? I'll be saving that for my Vergil video. I kind of feel like an analysis of Dante's boss fight only really makes sense when you break down Vergil's mechanics, and that can sustain a video in its own right. So again, the Dante fight will be saved for the Vergil video when it comes out. With that being said, this is the Gaming Grappler. I love making this content. I'll be producing a lot more Devil May Cry videos in the future because I love playing this game and I love being in the situation where I get to play more Devil May Cry 5. And that being said, have a good one, everyone.